Today is October 31st, 2024. This is episode 56 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I am your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I am joined by Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will go over Week 9 for the Big Ten in football, which included a couple close games, a couple of blowouts. And Joe, we are going to go to the Friday night game, which was definitely one of the least watched Big Ten football games probably ever due to what also was happening in LA on Friday, but the home team gets the job done. USC wins 42-20. I know it says 48 up there, that's a mistake. But USC gets the job done. Both teams were reeling coming in, and the Trojans win big and sink Rutgers even further.
Yeah, Sean, just like the World Series, the LA team got the better of the Metro New York team, and this one, kind of like the 4-1 almost sweep the Dodgers had, wasn't really close all that much. The offense for USC finally clicked. Miller Moss looked comfortable, and he looked comfortable mainly, Sean. He wasn't getting pressured every single play. That's been something they've dealt with in spurts at times, and luckily for them, Rutgers, who has a pretty formidable pass rush, especially with a defensive coach like Greg Schiano, they were not able to get home, and you just saw a comfortable Miller Moss and Woody Marks, who was pretty efficient on the ground. I know he had a few times he was stumped, but overall, 3 TDs, 2 passing TDs for Miller Moss. Sean, it's hard to think that's not what USC's offense should have looked like for most of the year, and it was good for them that they got back on track. Now, if you're a Rutgers fan, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The season is coming really close to teetering. Luckily for you, you have Minnesota at Maryland, Illinois at home, and at Michigan State. While those are all challenging games, I can't see why each one of those on an individual scale isn't winnable. Now, are they going to win all 4? Probably not, but I think getting to a bowl game in the second straight year is not the worst result for Rutgers, but based on where they were, and like USC, based on where they were, certainly disappointing. And I think for now, both teams are playing to just not have the season go completely off the rails. Now, there is rumblings that USC's looking at a few guys in the portal, look at any Discord, hear any message board, and also hearing it from insiders too that Miller Moss might be courted by a few major programs, some maybe even in the conference. So something to keep an eye on for the future. But for now, USC looked good, Rutgers did not, and I think it's as simple as that, Sean.
Yep, USC got back to the team that we thought they were all season, and Rutgers continues to fall near the bottom of the conference, and the standings are up for our YouTube viewers, and Rutgers is down there in second to last at 1-4 in the conference and 4-4 overall. USC also 4-4, but they are 2-4 in the conference. So the Trojans getting out of the basement for now, and Rutgers sinking even deeper. Now we'll go to Saturday, Joe, in a game that most people did not think would be very close. Dylan Raiola and the Huskers traveled to the Shoe to play Ohio State just a week after getting throttled by Indiana, and they put up about as good of a fight as you could expect. Ohio State does get the job done 21-18, but Nebraska had a lead in the middle of the fourth quarter. Are you giving Nebraska credit for hanging tough here, or is this a huge letdown from the Buckeyes?
I'm not even going to try to give the politician's answer. This was a ginormous letdown for the Ohio State Buckeyes. I really am not impressed. I know with all the injuries at left tackle, especially after Mikowski went down, I mean, it's just a revolving door there. And I think the one good piece of good news for Ohio State, because that was really it, is at least this didn't happen in the Penn State game, and that seems really weird. But I think Ohio State, for their next big matchup, which we'll talk about tomorrow night, it's not going to cost them as much. Like if this happened in the Penn State game, they wouldn't be able to scheme around it. One thing Ryan Day, and we'll talk about that in the next episode, he's done a good job. He can scheme very well. He can game plan, I think, as well as anyone in the country. And I think the fact that this did not happen the next week is really the main highlight. Talking about the running game for Ohio State, the pass protection wasn't good, and with that, especially when the tackles were performing, the running game also could not do anything. I think that's going to be the most frustrating part for Ohio State, especially after the Oregon game at the first half of the season. I think what encouraged a lot of people and made people think that Ohio State is probably in the front runner or even maybe second or third for the national title is the fact they can control the clock. They can run the ball, and they can obviously beat you in the air. I still don't think that's up for much dispute. I think Will Howard, without Will Howard in this game, like this was Kyle McCord on this team, I think they actually would have lost this game. But Will Howard gives them so much explosion on the ground. You have to count for his legs. And with the receiving combo of Jeremiah and Abuka and Cardell Tate, who had a heck of a game, ultimately the Buckeyes pulled through. They got the late score and they stopped Nebraska late. Now that targeting call, I think there were targetings in two games where the referee's call was questionable at best. I understand why Ryan Day acted like that, especially with the pressure on him. But Sean, Ohio State, there's no doubt about it. This was their worst performance of the season. And luckily for them, it came against a team in Nebraska that could not punish them as much offensively as some of these other teams that they're going to play on the remainder of their schedule.
Yeah, this was a worst case scenario for the Buckeyes, and really the only positive, Joe, is that they won this game. You chalk up the Oregon loss on the road. You didn't play that bad. You're still a good team. It could have gone either way. This sort of Ohio State performance is extremely concerning, especially with who they have up next. But, Joe, we will be doing our power rankings next week, actually, and this game will definitely cost Ohio State a couple spots. For me, even if they do win at Penn State next week, I do still think that an argument could have been made before this game that they're probably still a better team than Oregon. But after this one, Nebraska's a team that was cast aside by Indiana last week, 56-7, and the Ohio State almost lost this one. A serious letdown. Nebraska's defense, maybe was a little bit challenging, but still, they had 50 dropped on them last week. So Ohio State gets away with one here, and that's really the only positive is that they won this football game. All right, Joe, we go to Bloomington, Indiana, where College Game Day made it, and not for basketball. This was for football. The Washington Huskies come into town to play against Taven Jackson and the Indiana Hoosiers. Curtis Rourke missed the game with a thumb injury. The Hoosiers got on the board first with a pick six, took a lead, and held that lead for a majority of the game. They end up winning by 2 touchdowns, and the Hoosiers are 8-0 on the season. What did you think of this one?
I thought the gameplay with Taven Jackson was good. Now, I think a lot of people anticipated him having difficulties in the air, which he did. His QBR is not a 50 by accident. But what I liked about Cignetti is he utilized the kind of athlete Taven Jackson is. He wasn't afraid to use him on the ground, and I think that made Washington account for the quarterback run a lot in this game, which opened up holes for Ellison. And I know Tyson Lawton didn't have quite the game he probably envisioned, especially when he had to take on a bigger role. But I think the performance of Ellison, the fact he got 29 carries, speaks for itself, and that was really thanks to Taven Jackson being a threat on the ground. I want to highlight, Indiana had 9 guys with receptions. The highest number of receptions on the team was 2, Miles Price and Zach Horton. I think Indiana did a really good job of utilizing all their threats, albeit not all that much, aside from the ground game. And Sean, this was hard to say. It wasn't the most impressive win from Indiana, but when you consider the fact that Curtis Rourke was out and the fact that Washington at times has shown the ability to be really stymied and not turn the ball over, the fact you turned them over early, the fact you didn't even let the game get, you didn't even give Washington much hope, let's face it, Sean. So Indiana, really impressive. I wouldn't say this is certainly not their best win, but I'm pretty impressed only because this could have been a very close game, and Indiana made this a game they didn't really have to sweat much in, if at all. So really good on the Hoosiers, good for Curt Cignetti, and the stakes are getting even higher and higher for these Hoosiers.
Yeah, they have not been losing at all this year, ever. Let alone, haven't been losing in the second half. They have not been losing this season. And it was really good for Taven that they got a lead with the pick six. He did miss a couple throws that Rourke 100% makes. But they won this game on the ground 52 carries for 188. Now, that's not a great yards per carry, but when you're winning the football game like they were most of it, that'll do just fine. They have a couple good running backs. They have Taven, who's a threat on the ground, and they get the job done. Joe, this one really... you felt like Indiana should have won and was in control the whole game, which is exactly what you want, especially with your backup quarterback with all the hype around game day. And, for all things considered, this was a pretty stress-free victory from Indiana. The defense has looked a lot better the last couple weeks, and they are 8-0 overall with a big game up next before they go on bye. But, Joe, impressive from the Hoosiers here. Washington, just kind of been a mixed bag for them all season, really. They've looked really good in a couple games, including, their win over Michigan and a couple other games, but they still did lose to Rutgers. They did lose to Iowa. They dropped 40 on them, Iowa did, and then they lose this one here. So they do have a tough schedule remaining. They do go to play Penn State and Oregon, so they cannot drop the USC or UCLA game if they do want to go bowling. But Indiana is the top of the pile right now in the Big Ten. All right, Joe, we'll move on to the 3:30 game on CBS. This was probably one of the bigger games in college football this weekend. The number 1 Oregon Ducks hosted the number 20 Illinois Fighting Illini. And just like that, it was over really quick. 2 touchdowns in the first 2 drives for the Ducks. They went up big. They were up 35-3 at halftime, and the Ducks roll 38-9. Impressive one from the Ducks.
I think extremely impressive. I think now that they've ascended to this number 1 ranking, that's what number 1 teams do. Now, this is normally what you'd see a loss at Alabama or Georgia team in the past few years, where they're number 1, they play like a fringe top 25 team and blow them out of the water. This was really no different. Now, I think a few things I want to highlight is Illinois, we've talked about their run defense being weak at times. I think this game kind of exposed that. Now, is Illinois' run defense bad because they gave up the amount of yards they did in the first half to Oregon? No, not at all. It's not bad simply because of that fact. It's bad because it's been a continuous thing throughout the year, and I don't think Oregon had to show or put too much on film for a team like a Michigan like they're playing this week, a team like Wisconsin, or any future opponent they'll see in Indianapolis and very likely in the playoffs. So, efficient performance from Oregon, and it's pretty ridiculous that I'm saying efficient because they were dominant, but at the same time, this is what the expectation is. They're the number 1 team in the country. They should blow out teams that are fringe top 25 teams, especially one like Illinois, especially where Luke Altmaier struggled. I really want to highlight, although Birch was out for yet another game, I really think Mateo Ugalele, and I wanted to make sure I didn't say DJ because they are related, he's been getting home on the quarterback more. Bryce Becker, too. I think this team on defense, that's the most underrated aspect. Though they'll give up some points, they're very good at pressuring the quarterback, and as we've seen in the past few years, that's the great equalizer in college football. It's been that way in pro football most of our lives. Otherwise, the '07 Giants probably would not have lifted that Lombardi Trophy over the Patriots. But now you're seeing it slowly and surely translate to college. So, good performance for the Ducks. If you're Illinois, I don't think you got to be too discouraged. I do think they're going to be favored in the rest of their games. If Illinois does finish 10-2, they likely don't make the playoff, but hard to complain about a 10-win season in Champaign. This game was just one they were out of with it after the first 2 drives, Sean.
Yeah, we talked about them at Penn State, Joe, and that's Illinois. And they were able to make that game really ugly, but it never did feel like they were going to win it. And we thought that they might have been able to do that here, but still, they're a decent team, Illinois. They do have flaws on both sides of the ball, and those are flaws that good teams are going to expose, and they did that here. They blitzed them off the field early on. This game was over quick. That was just a very professional performance from Oregon, and at this point, Joe, I do think they've showed us the most out of any team in the country. They've won the big game. They've taken care of business after the first couple of mishaps early on, 24-14 over Idaho, and then a 3-point win over Boise State. But since then, Joe, nobody has been able to lay a glove on them. They smoke Illinois here. They get their starters out pretty quickly early on into the second half, and they move to 7-0 and 5-0 in the conference. But impressive one here, Illinois. I don't think even the most optimistic fan expected them to win this game. You're still in the top 25. You're still 6-2 on the year. You still have a good end of the season, but the flaws, good teams are going to expose them, and that's kind of exactly what happened here. All right, Joe, we'll move to Iowa, where the Hawkeyes hosted the Northwestern Wildcats. And Joe, this sort of year for Iowa's offense has been incredibly inconsistent. This is the second time they've dropped 40 points this year. And just a year ago, you'd think that would be absolutely crazy, but they improved to 5-3 with a 40-14 win over Northwestern. Caleb Johnson scores 3 touchdowns after a couple weeks of struggling, and the Hawkeyes dismantle Northwestern.
Yeah, Sean, and overwhelmingly, I hate to take the spotlight off Tim Lester or the Iowa offense. It was the entrance of Brendan Sullivan that really sparked this offense. He is going to be number one in the depth chart according to their recent reports. So I don't think that he's that much better than Cade. I do think he brought something different to the table. Ultimately, though, Sean, it was the same old, same old. Brendan Sullivan did do a lot of things on the ground, but the main highlight of the ground, as it's been all year, has been Caleb Johnson. I thought the way Michigan State stifled him was really discouraging in the moment, but it seems like that might have just been a one-off performance. And Northwestern certainly isn't as talented nor as good on defense as Michigan State, especially talent-wise. But Iowa just did a really good job. This was a clinical, business-like performance for the Hawkeyes. If you're Northwestern, I think you had some hope after the Maryland game, but after 2 straight blowout losses to former Big Ten West foes, I think you're staring early exit from the season in November right in the eye. As for Iowa, I think this is a step back in the right direction. I say back in the right direction because Sean perfectly mentioned that their offense has been extremely inconsistent and at times extremely ineffective. I mean, if you just watched the game a week ago in East Lansing, that Michigan State defense is good, but it's not one where Iowa's offense should have struggled the way it did and had to rely on chunk plays. So good on Iowa. I think Northwestern, again, just probably try to steal a game here and there, and maybe you could talk about bowl eligibility, but Iowa's real test is next week, and is this week, and we'll talk about that more tomorrow.
And Joe, as Jack Lausch has gotten more plays on film, defenses have definitely started to play him a little differently, and his effectiveness is going down big time. And that's something that we thought might have been the case just because of, very few games. But Iowa kept him to just 60 yards passing. And then coming into this game, it was said that Sullivan would play a part. And I don't know if they're going to roll with both going on, but, this part of being inconsistent, Joe, it means you're good some of the time, and that's a huge step in the right direction for Iowa compared to last year. And while they might win the same or even less games than a year ago, they're definitely not horrible at offense, which is a good sign for the future of Iowa football. They've had a number of good performances this year. Yes, the schedule has been a little on the easy side in this league, but you're 5-3, and you're a couple of good performances away from, being 9-3. If we're honest, Joe, they should win probably the rest of their games. They've got 2 home games against Nebraska and Wisconsin, and 2 road games against Maryland and UCLA. They're better than all 4 of those teams. And if we're sitting here and they're ranked 17th at the end of November at 9-3, well, all things considered, that'd be a really good season for the Hawkeyes.
Yeah, and I think one last thing before we move on. Brendan Sullivan, the fact he has eligibility next year, the Northwestern transfer who was jawing a lot with them, I forgot to mention that. It was really good to see him fired up that way. I hope he translates that to his future performances, whether that's this year and most likely next year. Maybe Iowa could build off that.
All right, Joe, we'll move on to the next game, and this is one that neither of us really had any sort of read on. 2 teams in the middle of the pack that have been good and bad at times, and it was nowhere even close. Minnesota wins 48-23 over Maryland up in Minnesota. And, Joe, this one was over quick. It was 21-0 Minnesota at the end of the first quarter, 34-10 at halftime, and then both teams sort of went through the motions in the second half to get to the final score. But, Joe, Max Brosmer is starting to put together a number of good performances in a row, and Minnesota's 5-3.
Yeah, this was his best performance of the year against a real team. 4 touchdowns. The fact they did not have to heavily rely on the running game the way they have in most of their 3-game win streak, I think is really good for Minnesota. Darius Taylor, Marcus Major, pretty ineffective days at the office. I know Darius Taylor had 81 on 15, but most of that was on a 51-yard chunk run. Not to take away credit from the young man, I do think he's still one of the premier backs. And I really think that run game at Minnesota is one of the more underrated run games in the Big Ten. So something we've highlighted often on this podcast. Max Brosmer off a bye. You could tell he was fired up to be out there. And Maryland, weirdly enough, they're on a bye this week. They looked like they did not want to be there at all. Pick six, down 21-0 before you knew it. I mean, this seemed like the spread on this game was within a touchdown. I mean, this game felt like a MAC team versus a Big Ten team, the way Minnesota moved the ball down and some of the mistakes from Maryland. And it's shocking that Maryland's 4-4 based on the way they've played in some of these games. You know, you had a few explainable losses, particularly the Michigan State one early. But after the blowout by Northwestern and after the blowout at the hands of Minnesota, it's really hard to imagine that Maryland's going to finish the year bowl eligible. I know they have some winnable games left, being Rutgers and Iowa at home, but I'm not confident that they'll even win those games. And then at Oregon and Penn State, we're not even going to discuss. But as for Minnesota, this is step in the right, or a huge step in the right direction. After the bye week, you thought maybe they would have cooled down a bit, but no, they're still on a heater, 3-game win streak. And the fact they're going to be favored in a game we're going to talk about tomorrow at a top 25 team like Illinois, I think that speaks volumes to the way their offense has opened up a lot of options. Now that Brosmer is not only comfortable running the ball, but comfortable throwing the ball, that makes the running game even more lethal. So I think playing Minnesota at the end of September, a lot of teams would not have cared. I think if you have to play them at the end of November or the middle of November, you're going to be staying up longer at night.
And Joe, this might be a conversation better suited for our power rankings episode, but they really should have won 2 of their 3 losses if you go back. The loss to North Carolina on the opening day with the kicking issues and then the near comeback at the Big House. But we might be getting to that time for Golden Gophers fans. Well, if we just didn't drop that one, we would be in a really good spot here. And I think that is the momentum is on their side. Since that Michigan loss, it's a 3-game win streak that you mentioned, and PJ Fleck is really turning things around. There might not be a team in the conference that has more momentum than Minnesota right now, other than maybe the 2 teams or 3 teams at the top. But Minnesota, it'll be interesting to see where they end up when we rank the teams next week. All right, Joe, we've got 2 more here, and this is going to end up perfectly with timing, which is why we're just doing the recap today, and then you'll see the previews tomorrow. Penn State heads to Wisconsin for Big Ten Saturday night. Look ahead spot big time for the Nittany Lions with Ohio State up next. Wisconsin, a team that's starting to put together a couple of good performances, but Penn State with a professional performance. They win 28-13. They do trail at halftime. It does take them a little bit to get off the mat, but a convincing second-half performance from Drew Aller and the Nittany Lions, and Penn State is 7-0.
Yeah, Sean, the biggest storyline is going to be the Drew Aller injury. I mean, that's going to trickle right into the next episode we do tomorrow. But I was more impressed with Bo Pribula than worried about Drew Aller. Obviously, I don't want any player to get injured, but I was more shocked that the Penn State offense looked as efficient with Pribula, if not more than efficient with him. The fact what he brings on the ground, I really hate comparing him to Taysom Hill, especially because he doesn't go out wide all that much, but he's that kind of player. You have to worry about him running, and the guy has an arm, too. You could tell that if Penn State, I'll put it to you this way, Sean. There were a lot of rumblings in the offseason that Pribula was getting courted by other schools. You can see why now. The guy could have been an effective starter anywhere in this conference, I think anywhere in the country, to be quite honest with you. And this game showed why. 11-13, didn't make too many bad decisions. I thought made a lot of good decisions running the ball. Now, did he have the explosive run? No, his longest yard was 9 or 10 yards. But the fact that teams have to account for that they have to commit another guy that now can no longer be in pass defense is definitely something Ohio State and Jim Knowles is not going to be a fan of. They would have had to prepare for it anyway, but the fact that they have coin flip chance to see it extensively, I think that's, I really believe Penn State, this, as weird as it sounds, the Drew Aller injury, from the film room perspective, could have been a blessing in disguise. Now, I want to talk about their defense for a little and Wisconsin's offense, which I think played hand in hand. Braden Locke did not look comfortable back there at all. 22 of 42. Never could really get anything going. The amount of coverage sacks and the amount of actual sacks and pressure Penn State put on him I think is the story of the game. Tommy Walker couldn't get anything going on the ground. I think Penn State, I'll put it this way, Sean. If Ohio State runs effectively on Penn State, it'll likely be through the means of Will Howard because the way they've looked all year, and especially in a big night game on Halloween weekend in Madison, this was a game we circled, Sean. Though it was close at times, and though the pick six really had to seal it, Penn State kept them at a safe distance, and ultimately they waited for Wisconsin to make the fatal mistake because Penn State didn't have to make that mistake. They just ran their offense pretty effectively. They let Prebula make good decisions, which, for the most part, Sean, he made all good decisions. And right now, Penn State's sitting at 7-0, and Wisconsin 5-3. I think they got momentum. Before this game, I don't think that necessarily stops. I like a Iowa. Their remaining schedule's pretty manageable outside of the game they play on the 16th against Oregon. So I think there's some positive takeaways for Wisconsin in this that they kept it in that they kept it close, and ultimately it was the fatal mistake that saved them, like it did most of the year. So Penn State 7-0, number 3 in the country. Wisconsin 5-3. I think the game played out the way I thought it would. It was close all the way through, and ultimately what blew it open in this case was that turnover at the end, Sean.
All right, Joe, we've got one game remaining. Your Michigan Wolverines knock off little brother Michigan State 24-17 in a game that, at the very minimum, stops the bleeding on the season for the Wolverines. Some quarterback news there. Jack Tuttle is retiring from football. Just too many injuries for him. He's played a number of years. So Davis Warren takes back over at quarterback. Alex Orji was in and out there. Warren did solidly 13 for 19, 123 and a touchdown. And Joe, running back Donovan Edwards with a 23-yard touchdown pass. Alex Orji also found the end zone on the ground. This game wasn't going very well early. The Spartans took a 7-0 lead. Michigan brings it back to 9-7 at halftime. Orji scores, and then Michigan pulls away, gets a 2-score lead late. Nick Marsh pulls it back to a 1-score game, but all in all, a pretty complete performance from the Wolverines, and maybe their most complete all year.
I don't want to have such a similar theme to the Wisconsin-Penn State game, but Michigan did not make any big mistakes in this game.
And they have to do that at this point.
At this stage, what people forget about Michigan, this is how I say it, they're one of the more talented teams in the conference still. I think that's an undisputed fact. They're not a good football team. So with teams like that, normally it's been shooting themselves in the foot, whether it's been turnovers, I lost the Washington game, whether it's been just a run offensively like you saw against Illinois. And in this game, they didn't let that happen. Although the first quarter they were outgained 135-1, and yes, that's an actual stat. Michigan State 135x'd Michigan's total yardage.
They only had one touchdown to show for it.
They got more creative. They used Alex Orji for the first time more effectively. And I'm going to be honest, Sean, this is probably what Kirk Campbell and Sherrod Moore envisioned for the Michigan offense all of August. If they knew Jack Tuttle was going to be injured, they figured they could run the 2 QB system. Whether you want to say it's because Michigan State's personnel wasn't as good as Texas, who really exposed that 2 QB system was never going to work, I think Michigan this time readjusted. Kalel Mullings, the runs weren't working. So what did they do? They put Donovan Edwards out wide. They ran him to the sides. Alex Orji, they motioned Mullings and they motioned Edwards, so that way they'd have to account for them. And they made it really 11 on 11 in the run defense. So I thought this was Kirk Campbell's best called game of the season. I don't want to take anything away from Michigan State, the player-wise, because I do think they were thoroughly outcoached, whether it was the early failed timeout on the 4th and goal at the 2, whether it was the I thought really foolishly that they got the first down and then they decided to get really aggressive. Something in a 7-6 ball game before the half you don't want to do. And I know you want to get as many points as possible, but when you have a freshman QB prone to the turnovers he had, and I get against Iowa, he was very protective with the ball. After one game, that should encourage you to do that, and they ultimately paid the price. Got down 9-7, and I think that was the tipping point, Sean. I think they dominated the first half, and the fact they were down 2, not having the ball after the half, and then Michigan had a 2-score margin most of the second half. I think that's going to be really discouraging for Michigan State because I thought they played well enough to win, but it was the coaching malfeasance, the failed timeout, failed missed field goal, the the rush drive. And I really think not letting Nate Carter eat. Nate Carter was the best player on offense on the field on Saturday, even running for countless 3rd and 8+ first downs. And they couldn't get him in good enough situations. They couldn't get to 4th and short a lot where they could have used him. They false started at the wrong times. And the stuff at the end, I'm not going to get into. That's sports radio talk. One thing I will say, I doubt Jonathan Smith, coming from Oregon State and Oregon, doesn't understand the significance of in-state rivalries. And you could tell from his press conference this week, he felt it. His quote was, "I'll remember that sucker." I'm pretty sure it's going to be plastered all over the Michigan State locker room. If it's not already, it certainly will be in the offseason. So Michigan State, I know it's discouraging. First 3-year losing streak to Michigan. I do think you could take a lot from this year. You're 4-4. You're 2 wins away from bowl eligibility with Rutgers and Purdue on the schedule. That should be very doable. And maybe you steal a game against Indiana or Illinois. So really disappointing performance for the Spartans. Probably their worst performance in a game, especially considering 3 of their 4 losses were to then top 25 teams, and 2 of them are to top 5 teams. So really good on Michigan. This allows their season not to go completely into the iceberg that sank the Titanic, although I do think they need one more signature win for fans to really calm down. This just avoided the ultimate disaster, as we talked about on one of those popular reels last week.
And Joe, for Michigan State first, it's just a missed opportunity. Say what you will about Michigan, but this is probably the worst that they're going to be for a while, and since a while before. But they had a chance to knock off their rival. They don't do it. And Michigan, probably the sharpest game that they've played this year. Even in the USC victory, they did make a couple of mistakes, and they were able to get away with them. But Michigan gets the job done here. 4 games left for the Wolverines. You will probably be underdogs in 3 of them. You would expect them to beat Northwestern at home, which, of course, would get them to bowl eligibility. But, Joe, a 7-5 with a huge win. And, they play Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State. 7-5 with a huge win would feel a lot better than 6-6 playing in the Cheez-It Bowl against Toledo. No offense to them. But Michigan, you can breathe for now. It doesn't get much tougher than who's coming to town next week, though. But that's all we have for you today. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the In a Nutshell podcast, and we'll see you later.